John Reynolds had always been a man of strength and honor. A former Marine, he carried himself with an air of authority that earned him respect wherever he went. After leaving the military, he found a new career as a security consultant, which kept him away from home more often than he liked. His wife, Emily, had always been his anchor, the one who held the home together. They were a picture-perfect couple once, their love strong and their future bright. However, as the years passed and John's job required him to travel more frequently, the connection between them began to fray. Emily had always been a loving wife and mother, known in their small town of Meadowbrook for her warmth and kindness. But the long, lonely nights without John were beginning to take a toll. She filled her time with volunteering at St. Mary's Church and spending time with their 2 children, but the absence of her husband left an emptiness inside her that no amount of activity could fill. She longed for the companionship and attention she once received from John, but his work kept him away, often leaving her to cope with her feelings of loneliness in silence. The arrival of Father Mark, the new priest at St. Mary's, was a blessing to the community. Charismatic, kind, and deeply compassionate, he quickly became beloved by the townspeople. Emily, seeking solace in her quiet sorrow, began attending more services, and soon her visits to the church became more frequent. Father Mark was a good listener, and he always had comforting words for those who sought his counsel. Emily, drawn to his calm presence, found herself sharing more with him than she had ever shared with anyone else. Father Mark's gentle demeanor and understanding nature provided Emily with the comfort she had been desperately seeking. He listened patiently to her struggles with her marriage, her fears about the growing distance between her and John, and the loneliness she felt in the quiet moments of the night. She never intended for her feelings to become more than that, but as the weeks passed, she began to look forward to their private conversations. Their connection grew stronger, and soon their exchanges weren't just about Emily's troubles. She found herself drawn to the warmth of Father Mark's words, to the way he made her feel understood and cared for. It wasn't long before she found herself confiding in him about more personal matters, things she'd never told anyone, even John. Father Mark, too, began to look forward to their talks. His professional demeanor as a priest began to slip away, and he found himself feeling something deeper for Emily than just pastoral concern. Her vulnerability, the way she opened up to him, stirred something inside him. It was innocent at first, just a comforting hand on her shoulder or a gentle touch as he consoled her. But as the weeks passed, their meetings became longer, and the tension between them began to shift. Emily's loneliness, paired with Father Mark's quiet but intense attention, created a bond neither of them had expected. One afternoon, after a particularly long conversation about her struggles with John's absence, Emily and Father Mark found themselves alone in the church. The quiet sanctuary, usually a place of peace, felt charged with something else that day. Emily hadn't planned to stay so long, but as she stood by the altar, her heart heavy with confusion and need, Father Mark stepped closer. His eyes were soft, but there was an intensity in them that hadn't been there before. Before she knew it, their lips met in a kiss that sent shockwaves through her body. Emily pulled away quickly, startled by the force of her own emotions. She had never intended for anything like this to happen. But Father Mark didn't retreat. He stayed close, his eyes full of unspoken understanding. It was a moment of weakness, a brief lapse in judgment, but it marked the beginning of something that would alter the course of all their lives. The kiss was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Emily and Father Mark's relationship deepened. They would meet after services in the quiet corners of the church or in the secluded park near the church grounds. The secrecy of their meetings fueled the intensity of their emotions. Emily found herself craving the moments when she was with him, as if his presence filled a void in her she hadn't even realized existed. Father Mark, too, found himself swept away by their connection, but he never allowed himself to acknowledge the darkness in what they were doing. He justified it to himself, telling himself that Emily needed him, that she was struggling, and he was merely providing the guidance she sought. But with each stolen moment, the line between spiritual guidance and something more blurred further. Emily, too, justified it to herself. She hadn't meant for any of this to happen, but it had. She had fallen into a situation she couldn't control. In the quiet moments after their meetings, she would lie awake, guilt gnawing at her. But the longing for Father Mark kept her from pulling away. She told herself that it was just a temporary escape from the pain of her marriage, a fleeting connection that could be forgotten once John returned. But deep down, she knew the truth. It was more than that. She had crossed a line, and she wasn't sure she could come back from it. Meanwhile, John was growing increasingly suspicious. His job kept him on the road, but when he was home, he noticed the changes in Emily. She was distant, preoccupied, and often seemed lost in thought. Her visits to the church grew more frequent, and she would spend long hours there, even when there was no service. John had always trusted Emily, but he couldn't ignore the feeling in his gut that something was wrong. He began asking questions, probing in ways that only made Emily more defensive. One evening, John decided to follow Emily. He told himself it was just to reassure himself, to ease his own growing anxiety. But as he parked outside the church and watched her walk inside, he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He waited, sitting in his car in the cold, his breath fogging up the windows. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he needed to know the truth. It wasn't long before he saw Father Mark exit the church, his face flushed and his expression guarded. He had seen Emily and Father Mark talking before, but this time the priest seemed to be lingering, and the two exchanged words in hushed tones. It didn't look like a normal conversation, and John's heart began to race. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. When Emily finally emerged from the church, she was alone, but the tension in the air was thick. She didn't notice John's car parked a few yards away, but he had seen enough to confirm his worst fears. The next few days were a blur. John's suspicions weighed heavily on him. He confronted Emily, but she denied everything. She claimed they were just talking, that Father Mark had been offering her guidance and support during a difficult time. But John's gut told him otherwise. The whispers around town, the strange glances, the way people looked at them when they were together, all pointed to something more. He tried to dismiss it, but the more he thought about it, the harder it became to ignore. The tipping point came when he saw them again. This time, he followed them into the church. They were sitting together in one of the pews, talking in low voices, their heads bent together. Emily's hand brushed Father Mark's, and for a moment, John's vision blurred. He felt the ground shift beneath him, as though the very foundation of his world was cracking. He had to know the truth. John could feel his pulse quicken as he stood there in the shadows, watching Emily and Father Mark, his heart sinking with every passing second. The weight of his suspicions was unbearable, but seeing them together, so close, so intimate, was like a blow to the chest. The once steady foundation of his life was crumbling, and he didn't know what to do or who to trust anymore. He was no longer just worried about the distance growing between him and Emily. Now, he feared something far worse was happening right under his nose. His breath came in shallow bursts as he stepped back quietly, trying not to make a sound. The image of them sitting together, their hands brushing, burned into his mind. He could feel his world unraveling with each step he took away from the church. In a daze, he walked to his car and sat there for what seemed like hours, trying to process what he had just seen. His mind raced, but every thought seemed to spin him in circles. Emily's face, the way she had been acting lately, the way she had become more distant, everything now seemed like a sign, a warning he had been too blind to notice. That night, Emily came home late, as usual. She looked tired, her eyes red from what John assumed were tears. She didn't say much, but there was a tension in the air that neither of them could ignore. John tried to act normal, but the distance between them was palpable. He didn't know how to ask her about what he had seen. It felt impossible, like he was stepping into a realm where everything he thought he knew about his wife and their life together might not be real. His mouth was dry and his throat ached, but the words he needed to say wouldn't come out. Instead, he spent the night in restless silence, lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering when everything had gone wrong. He thought about the love he had once shared with Emily, the way they had built a life together, the way they had been a team through thick and thin. How had they gotten to this point? How had they arrived at such a fragile place where trust seemed to be slipping through his fingers like sand? The next day, he decided he couldn't keep pretending that nothing was wrong. He had to confront Emily, no matter how difficult it might be. He couldn't go on living with this knot in his stomach, this feeling that the woman he loved, his wife, was slipping away from him in ways he couldn't understand. When Emily returned from the church that afternoon, John didn't wait for her to settle in. He stood up from the kitchen table, his face pale and tense. "We need to talk," he said, his voice strained. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with anticipation. Emily's expression faltered for a moment, her eyes flicking nervously to the door as if she might flee from the confrontation. "What about?" she asked softly, avoiding his gaze. "I saw you with Father Mark," John replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "In the church. Last night. What's going on, Emily? Tell me the truth." Emily froze, her face draining of color. For a moment, it seemed like she might deny it, might say it wasn't what it looked like, but then she looked up at him, her eyes wide, filled with guilt and something else, something he couldn't name. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "I don't know what to say," she finally muttered, her voice breaking. "I never meant for this to happen." John's heart sank. He didn't need her to say anything more. He already knew what was happening, the way she had avoided his questions, the way she had distanced herself. It all made sense now. His wife, the woman he had loved for so many years, had found comfort in someone else. And not just anyone, Father Mark, the man they had trusted to guide their family, to be a moral compass in their lives. He couldn't wrap his mind around it. How had it gone this far? How had she fallen into the arms of another man, someone who had sworn a vow of celibacy, someone who was supposed to be a spiritual leader? John's mind raced with 1,000 questions, each one more painful than the last. "Why?" he choked out, his voice shaking. "Why him? Why did you have to do this? We had a good life, Emily. We had everything." "I don't know, John," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I've been so lonely. You've been gone so much, and I don't know how it happened, but Father Mark, he was there for me. He listened to me. He understood what I was going through." John felt his stomach twist. The pain of betrayal was so sharp that it felt like a physical wound. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to process her words. The truth was, he knew what Emily was saying. He had been distant, focused on his career, and their marriage had suffered because of it. But that didn't make what she had done any easier to accept. He had been away, yes, but he never expected his absence to drive her into the arms of another man, especially not a man she trusted with their faith. "I never wanted to hurt you," Emily continued, her voice barely audible. "I swear, I didn't mean for this to happen. It just did. I didn't know how to stop it, and now I'm lost, John. I don't know what to do. I've made a terrible mistake." John's mind was reeling. His thoughts were a mess, tangled up in anger, betrayal, confusion, and heartbreak. He had no idea how to fix this, how to move forward from here. He had always believed that love and trust were the foundation of a strong marriage, but now, both of those pillars had crumbled, leaving him standing in the ruins of their life together. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Emily," he said quietly, his voice filled with pain. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." "I understand," Emily whispered, her eyes downcast. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I've destroyed everything." The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity. John's chest ached with the weight of the conversation, but he couldn't find the strength to walk away. He still loved her, despite everything, but the trust they had once shared seemed irreparably broken. And then, just as John thought he couldn't take any more, a realization hit him like a freight train. What if Father Mark had been using Emily for his own selfish desires? What if he had manipulated her, preyed on her vulnerability and loneliness? The thought made John's blood run cold. Father Mark wasn't just an innocent bystander in this situation. He was an active participant, someone who had taken advantage of Emily's pain. But John couldn't just confront Father Mark without proof. He had no idea how deep this went, or what kind of hold the priest had over his wife. All he knew was that the only way to get to the truth was to confront Father Mark directly. He had to find out if this was something that had spiraled out of control, or if it was something far darker than he could even imagine. The following day, John found himself outside the church again. The weight of what had happened between him and Emily felt like a heavy chain around his neck, pulling him deeper into despair. His hands trembled as he stood there, staring up at the tall, imposing structure. For years, this place had been a sanctuary, a symbol of faith and trust, not just in God, but in the people who helped guide their lives. Now it felt like a place of betrayal. John took a deep breath and walked through the familiar doors, his steps slow and deliberate. The air inside was cool, heavy with the scent of incense and wood. The church was empty, save for the soft sound of footsteps echoing in the distance. It felt surreal to be here under these circumstances. Father Mark had always been a pillar of the community, a man who held the trust of everyone around him. Now, John felt a surge of anger at the thought of him and Emily, and the betrayal that had taken root in their marriage. As he moved down the aisle, he spotted Father Mark standing near the altar, his back turned, his hands clasped in prayer. The sight made John's blood boil, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was not the time for rash actions. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Father Mark must have sensed someone approaching, because he turned around just as John reached the altar. His face softened when he saw him, but John could see the flicker of something in his eyes, an emotion that John couldn't quite place. "John." Father Mark greeted him, his voice warm but tinged with something distant, something cold. "It's good to see you. What brings you here today?" John didn't waste time with pleasantries. He stepped forward, his voice steady but full of tension. "I need to talk to you, Father, about Emily." Father Mark's expression faltered for a split second, but he quickly regained his composure. He stepped closer to John, his gaze searching. "Of course. What's troubling you?" John didn't beat around the bush. "I know what's been going on between you and my wife." Father Mark's face went pale, and his lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something, but then he simply stood there, silently. John's fists clenched at his sides. The silence between them stretched, a barrier that felt impossible to break. "You think this is something I've wanted, don't you?" Father Mark said, his voice soft but laced with an edge that John hadn't expected. "You think I've been trying to take something from you, but you're wrong, John. This has nothing to do with what you think." John took a step closer, his voice rising. "Don't lie to me. I saw you with her. I saw the way you looked at her, the way she looked at you. It's not just some innocent conversation. You're taking advantage of her, Father. She's been vulnerable, and you've preyed on that." Father Mark shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "That's not what's happened here, John. Emily is a beautiful, strong woman, and she came to me for guidance. Nothing more, nothing less. What's between us is nothing but a spiritual connection." John felt the anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. This wasn't the time to get emotional. He needed the truth. "So what's all this about, then? Why has Emily been so distant from me lately? Why has she been seeking you out?" Father Mark sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I never asked for any of this. Emily was lost, and she needed help. I've been trying to give her what she needs, helping her find her way again. But I never intended for things to go the way they have." John's mind raced. It was clear that Father Mark was trying to paint himself as the victim in all of this, but John wasn't buying it. He knew what he had seen, and he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut that something deeper was going on. "I don't believe you," John said coldly. "I think you've been using her, Father. You've been manipulating her, preying on her loneliness. And now, because of you, my entire life is falling apart." Father Mark looked away for a moment, his eyes dropping to the floor, and when he spoke again, his voice was tinged with regret. "I never meant to hurt anyone, John. I never meant for any of this to happen. But you need to understand something. Emily is not the only one who's been struggling. I've been struggling too." John's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Father Mark looked up at him, his expression strained. "I've been carrying the weight of my vows for years, John, and it's been harder than I ever imagined. The loneliness, the isolation. It's a constant battle. When Emily came to me, I saw someone who was hurting, someone I could help, but I didn't expect to form this kind of bond with her. I didn't expect to feel this way." John's heart sank as he realized what Father Mark was implying. This wasn't just about Emily's vulnerability. It was about the priest's own inner struggles, his own desires. He had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. "I don't care what you've been struggling with," John said, his voice low but firm. "You've betrayed my wife. You've destroyed everything." Father Mark's eyes welled up with emotion, but he didn't try to defend himself further. Instead, he nodded slowly, as though accepting the weight of his actions. "I'm sorry, John. I truly am. But there's nothing I can do to change what's already been done." For a moment, the two men stood there in silence, the gravity of the situation hanging heavy in the air. John didn't know what to say next. He felt exhausted, drained from the emotional weight of everything that had happened. His marriage was in ruins, his faith in people shattered, and the future seemed uncertain. But there was one thing John knew for sure. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't let Father Mark get away with what he had done to Emily, to their family. He had to find a way to make things right, even if it meant facing the truth of his own flaws, his own mistakes. He turned and walked away from Father Mark, the weight of the conversation still pressing down on him. There was still so much to figure out, so much that needed to be resolved, but for now, all he could do was take it one step at a time. As he stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, John felt the weight of his decision settle on him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he couldn't give up on Emily. Not yet. He just had to figure out how to fix what had been broken, and whether or not they could rebuild the trust that had been shattered. As John stepped into the cold air, the weight of the day pressed heavily on his chest. He needed answers, but he was running out of time. He had confronted Father Mark, and while the priest's words were filled with regret, John couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something was off. But what? He walked aimlessly down the street, trying to clear his mind, to think through all the chaos. Emily had become a stranger to him, and Father Mark, well, John didn't know what to make of him anymore. How had everything gone so wrong? The more he thought, the more the fragments of their life together seemed to slip through his fingers, out of his control. As he passed the old bookstore on the corner, he noticed a familiar figure standing near the window. Emily. She was holding something in her hands, her eyes lost in thought. A sense of unease swept over John. What was she doing here? She wasn't supposed to be out, especially not after everything that had happened. He stepped closer, his heart pounding. He watched her for a moment, trying to gather the strength to approach. But before he could take another step, Emily turned and saw him. Her face, once full of warmth, was now cold, distant. She didn't smile, didn't acknowledge him like she used to. John's stomach churned. He opened his mouth to speak, but Emily held up her hand, stopping him before he could utter a single word. "John," she said, her voice flat and emotionless, "I need to talk to you." John's heart sank. There was something about the way she said it, the way she was looking at him, that made him uneasy. It wasn't the Emily he knew. This was someone different, someone he didn't recognize. "Okay," he said, his voice tight. "What is it?" Without a word, Emily stepped aside and motioned for him to enter the bookstore. Hesitant but desperate for answers, John followed her inside. The musty smell of old books filled the air, and the dim lighting added to the atmosphere of mystery. Emily walked towards the back of the store, where a small desk sat, covered in stacks of paper. She took a seat and motioned for John to do the same. He sat across from her, his mind racing. Emily didn't look at him, instead staring at the desk, her fingers nervously tapping on the wood. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "John, I've been thinking. I've been thinking about everything. The church, Father Mark, us. and I've realized something." John leaned forward, his breath catching in his throat. "What have you realized, Emily?" She paused, her eyes finally meeting his. There was no warmth in them, no love, only coldness. "I've realized that I've been living a lie. Not just with you, but with myself. Everything I thought I knew about love, about trust, was wrong." John's mind spun. This wasn't the Emily he knew. What was she saying? "Emily, please, I don't understand. What are you talking about?" She sighed, as though the weight of what she was about to say had been crushing her for a long time. "John, I never wanted to hurt you, but I've been hiding something from you. Something that goes beyond Father Mark. It's not just about him." John's confusion deepened, but a sense of dread settled in his chest. His gut was screaming that he wasn't prepared for what she was about to say. "The truth is," Emily continued, her voice trembling slightly, "Father Mark wasn't the one I was turning to. I wasn't looking for him for guidance, John. I was looking for someone else. Someone you wouldn't even believe if I told you." John froze, his blood running cold. "What do you mean? Who else?" Emily looked down at her hands, a mixture of shame and guilt written across her face. "The truth is, I've been in love with someone else for months. Someone I never thought I would fall for. It's been happening slowly, over time, and I've been lying to you about it all. I didn't want you to know, but I can't keep living this lie anymore." John felt like the floor had just been ripped out from under him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the words she was saying, but it didn't add up. Who else could it be? "Who, Emily?" he demanded, his voice strained. "Tell me who." Emily looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. "It's you, John. I've been in love with you all along." John blinked, stunned. "What are you talking about?" "Not in the way I thought, though," she said quietly. "I thought I was in love with the idea of us, the way things used to be. But over time, I realized that it wasn't just that. It wasn't just nostalgia. I fell in love with the version of you that I wanted you to be. I fell in love with the idea of fixing you, of making you something that you weren't. But in doing that, I lost myself. And I lost you." John's mind was spinning, trying to process what she was saying. He couldn't make sense of it. What had happened to the woman he had married? What had happened to the life they had built together? "I don't understand, Emily," he said, his voice breaking. "If you loved me, why would you do this? Why would you hurt me like this? Why would you go to Father Mark?" Emily's lips quivered as she spoke. "Because I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to make you see me again. I didn't know how to reach you, John. You were so distant, so cold. I thought maybe I could find something else, someone else who could show me what I had been missing." John stood up, shaking his head in disbelief. This wasn't the woman he thought he knew. This wasn't his Emily. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A small black book, hidden underneath the pile of papers on the desk. Without thinking, he reached for it and flipped it open. What he saw inside made his blood run cold. The pages were filled with meticulous notes, names, dates, and locations. Details that seemed to describe every step of Emily's affair. But it wasn't with Father Mark. It wasn't with anyone he had suspected. It was with someone much closer to home. The twist hit him like a punch to the stomach. It was with someone he never, ever would have expected. Someone he trusted, someone who was supposed to be on his side. Emily's affair wasn't just with Father Mark. It was with someone he had always considered a friend. The realization struck him like a lightning bolt. His world crumbled around him piece by piece, and as he stared at the pages of that book, he knew that the story wasn't over. It was just beginning.